This again is from the Scientific American book that we've been using on becoming human, and this particular one looks a little bit at intelligence, which I don't think is very well defined, because you can always use the idea of the daisy world, dark daisies, light daisies, to see how they can control the environment, the temperature, for example, by changing the albedo. I won't go into the details, but essentially intelligence may not be a very well defined quantity or quality or whatever you want to call it. So this particular section of the Scientific American book Becoming Human from 2013 looks at how we came to be. Our vaunted cognitive capacities may have originated rather as feathers did, as an exaptation that arose in one context before being exploited in another context. So we will define what exaptation is before next. Came from Stephen Gould and Verba, which is an interesting concept, and I love Stephen Gould's work and writings. Some 28,000 years ago, this 60-year-old man was given an elaborate burial rife with implications of ceremonial practices. You can see all the beads and jewelry and so on, and of abstract belief. So that requires a certain cognitive abilities, maybe symbols and so on and so forth, symbolic communication, etc. He was interred with rich grave goods and was wearing bracelets, necklaces, pendants, and a tunic on which hundreds of mammoth ivory beads have been sewn. Along with two juvenile burials from the same site, Sungir in Russia, this is one of the earliest and most resplendent examples of human burials found in Europe. So vaunted here is not, I don't always consider it as a good word, but it's basically something enviable, but also something to be boasting about and so on. So our cognitive capacities, who would envy them? I don't know if animals envy us, but we envy each other based on our intelligence as measured by success or writing abilities, poetry, music, etc. Right? So the paper from Stephen Gould and Verba has this table, a taxonomy of fitness, looks at the process, character, and usage. Natural selection shapes the character for a current use. We call it adaptation, so you can think of it as genetic. So character is that it is adaptation, and it has a functional use, of course. A character previously shaped by natural selection for a particular function, so an adaptation as defined here, is co-opted for a new use. So they call it co-optation. So that can have partly exaptation, which we haven't defined yet, and adaptation, and its usage is in effect. So character whose origin cannot be ascribed to the direct action of natural selection, so non-adaptation, is co-opted for a current use, which is co-optation. So it's exaptation. Okay, so this is not adaptation, co-optation. This is non-adaptation, co-optation. So that's called exaptation. You take it from one situation and put it and find it useful, and again you end up with a usage that then survives genetic propagation somehow. Okay, so keep that word exaptation in mind, and Stephen Gould argues that this should be used more often, but you actually don't find it used that often in the mainstream evolutionary biology, but I'm not an expert on that, so maybe you know more. So here is an argument that humans had a vocal tract that could produce the sounds of articulate speech. There are ideas about how the Adam's apple moved and allowed us to make sounds that we couldn't make before, or our primate relatives cannot make, etc. Or that we learned it from birds, which can make very sophisticated sounds as well. And this happened over 500,000 years before we have evidence our forebears used language, and it's not clear whether adults learned it or children learned it, and so on and so forth. Among numerous possibilities for how language may have been invented is that an initial form was created not by adults but by children. We've also in other contexts talked about gossip being the origin for language as a way to create social bonds and structures and maybe power by tributary power and so on and so forth. And there are many details. There is literature arguing that children learn language on the intuitive part of the brain, so they can pick up many languages, whereas for an adult mostly it becomes an intellectual activity, and it's hard to learn a language after you've grown up. So those kind of ideas exist as well. So if we look at modern human and Neanderthals, look at the structure of the pharynx and the larynx, the voice box, you can see that this is a significantly different structure here. This corresponds to the movement of the Adam's apple that I mentioned. Comparison of the head and neck of a modern human and a reconstructed Neanderthal shows the difference in the structure of the vocal tract. The much longer pharynx in the modern human is what makes possible the full range of sounds demanded by articulate speech, singing, and so on. There are many tribes which just talk through clicks and clacks and various sounds, right? Musical instruments such as this bone flute from a French site date back at least 32,000 years. They are some of the most striking indicators of a new sensibility in early humans. There are ideas that the inner ear evolved from fish, for example, so there must be a combination of things happening on the pharynx and the inner ear, and the ability to sense frequencies of sound that may have changed over time as well. Obviously we don't have as many frequency ranges as the dogs have, for example, but still, and some people are called pitch deaf, tone deaf, and so on and so forth as well. So this just argues in a very succinct way that we are special also in terms of the communication through sounds and symbolic language. So there's combination of traits, brain, ear, and the pharynx. But now it's also special that we can describe things that don't necessarily exist. Just taking the idea from I think the Sapiens or Switch, the book by Dan and Chip Heath. We are special because we can describe a fruit that may look like a grapefruit and smell like a a lemon, but tastes like a mango, which doesn't exist. But when we describe it, you already feel your mirror neurons kicking for the odor and the taste and so on. So can other animals do it? This is the question of how we define intelligence, because often we don't even know how to measure it. And some of the general definitions are to see if animals have the so-called theory of mind. Can they guess what you're going to do next? And that's not so hard, because dogs and chimpanzees and elephants and others can sense that they're going to get fed, or that somebody's coming home, by the sounds of the car and what motion the zookeeper is making, and so on and so forth. To take it further, humans have secondary theory of mind, so I can guess what you are thinking about another person, so it's kind of a convoluted idea, but important one nonetheless. And there is also the idea that do animals learn things? We will see that there are chimpanzees and birds and other animals which can use tools. Do they build tools? Yes, sometimes. And do they just learn vertically or genetically inherited, or is it behavioral learning? And even if it is behavioral, can they then teach it to others? Is it only a utilitarian thing they learn? For example, it's found that dolphins were seen walking on water, which had no utilitarian value. They were just doing it for fun, and they somehow learned it. But critically, they were then able to teach it to other dolphins, saying, hey, do this, this is real fun. It's like dancing on the water. So those are considered additional signs of intelligence. But this debate can go on forever, and there's a lot of literature on this as well. In this context, let's just say that maybe Becoming Us took this ability to grow certain structures that allow us to make the sounds speak, let you hear properly, and or sing or whatever. So that's the idea of this. So I wanted to just include it here.